Alright guys, welcome back to Underground Science, and in this video we'll be talking about one of the glial cells of the central nervous system called the ependymal cells. Alright, so the ependymal cells are mostly found lining the ventricles of the brain, so the ventricles of the brain, and they're found lining the central canal of the spinal cord. Alright, so they're also found lining the central canal of the spinal cord. Central canal of spinal cord. So let's go and talk about what the basic function of the ependymal cells are. Alright, so first things first, the ependymal cells are simple cuboidal cells. Alright, so they're a type of epithelial cells, and the type is a simple cuboidal epithelial cell. Alright, so epithelial cell. Alright, and so let's say we have a ventricle here. Let's say, I don't know, we're talking about the lateral ventricle, right? So let's go and draw the lateral ventricle, right? Let's say we have the lateral ventricle here. We're going to see that we have these simple cuboidal epithelial cells with this nucleus and DNA with these hair-like projections called cilia. And we're going to see these simple cuboidal epithelial cells lined throughout the ventricles of the brain. Alright, so let's say this is one of the ventricles of the brain. So let's go and label this as a ventricle, like a zoomed in version of a ventricle of a brain, or in the brain, right? Ventricle in the brain. We're going to see that we have simple cuboidal epithelial cells lining, lining the ventricle of the brain, all right? And so we have a couple of jobs for the ependymal cells, right? So the ependymal cells of the brain. So we have the ventricle here, and we have some simple cuboidal epithelial cells and lining it. And so what happens is that these ependymal cells actually secrete cerebrospinal fluid. Alright, so they secrete cerebrospinal fluid. So let's go and write this down. Ependymal cells secrete cerebrospinal fluid. Secrete cerebrospinal fluid. Alright, so they help secrete cerebrospinal fluid along with another structure that's actually called the choroid plexus. Alright, so they help secrete cerebrospinal fluid. So that's one thing. And one thing to make sense of is that this is the ventricle of the brain, right? Let's say this is one of the ventricles of the brain. Now outside we have the brain tissue. So let's say we have neurons out here, right? We're going to have neurons out here. And just to save time, we won't draw the myelin on them, but then we see the axon here, and then the synapse, and we'll draw a couple more surrounding the ventricles of the brain, right? This is represented in our brain tissue. So then we're going to have more neurons here, let's say right here in our soma cell body, and then our axon, and then our synapse and axon terminal. So as you can see that the inside the ventricles is going to be the cerebrospinal fluid. All right, so here is going to be the cerebrospinal fluid, and so the inside the ventricles is going to be cerebrospinal fluid, but outside the ventricles, in between the neurons, the many neurons that we have inside our brain tissue, we're going to have, capillaries and interstitial fluid. All right, so then we're going to have a different type. It's not going to be cerebrospinal fluid, though. We're going to have interstitial fluid here, all right, in between our neurons of our brain tissue. So all this is going to be interstitial fluid, all right, fluid between our neurons and our brain tissue. Just a little bit, but we're going to have interstitial fluid. So let me go and label that out. So we're going to have interstitial means pretty much fluid between our neurons, all right? So interstitial fluid in between our neurons and our brain tissue. So as you can see, it kind of looks like the ependymal cells act as a kind of a barrier from our cerebrospinal fluid to our interstitial fluid, and our fluid between our neurons, right? So these cilia that you see here act as pretty much movers, right? They move the cerebrospinal fluid around, right? Sorry about scrolling up there, but they move the cerebrospinal fluid around, right, inside these ventricles. Okay, so they move the cerebrospinal fluid around. So let's go and write these down. So they circulate their cerebrospinal fluid around, right? So they help circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. All right, so the ependymal cells help circulate the cerebrospinal fluid, and we also said that they kind of help or notice I'm saying help, right? They're not the blood-brain barrier, right? They're not the same as astrocytes, but they help act as a kind of like a barrier in from our so let me write this down. So they help act as a barrier, right? Somewhat like a barrier between our cerebrospinal fluid and our interstitial fluid. All right, act as a barrier between our cerebrospinal fluid and inter interstitial fluid. All right, interstitial. I don't know why I wrote it like that, but yeah, well, what the heck? I don't know why I wrote it like that. Never mind. Let's go ahead and just write the whole thing out. We'll just say interstitial fluid like that, all right? So it helps us act as a barrier between our cerebrospinal fluid and interstitial fluid, all right? At least a little bit. Like, for example, it may help protect or it may help prevent large molecules like, I don't know, large proteins or something to cross the ependymal cells and reach the interstitial fluid, right? So it may protect things like that. So help large molecules from entering the interstitial fluid. All right. So far we've got that the ependymal cells circulate the cerebrospinal fluid, right, or secrete the cerebrospinal fluid. They help circulate the cerebrospinal fluid with their cilia-like projections, and they're simple cuboidal cells, right? We already mentioned that type of epithelial cells. They kind of help act as a barrier between the cerebrospinal fluid, which is inside the ventricles, and the interstitial fluid, which is outside the ventricles and between our neurons and our brain tissue. All right. So that's pretty much the job of ependymal cells, right? One thing we should also know is that we will see that sometimes we see like a blood capillaries here, right? Like very small blood capillaries that are roaming around here, and maybe we'll see that some nutrients that are needed for the ependymal cells to secrete the cerebrospinal fluid will kind of diffuse along and enter the ependymal cells so that ependymal cells can use those nutrients and fluids from the blood capillaries to help secrete their cerebrospinal fluid. All right, so things like that. And that's pretty much the basic overview of the ependymal cells that we see in our glial cells of the central nervous system. I really hope this video made sense to you guys. In my future videos, I'll be talking about more cool topics about biochem, physics, and chem. I really hope to see you guys there. Don't forget to hit that notification bell, like and subscribe, and make sure to stay safe. All right, see you guys next time.